Welcome, everyone. We still have people joining us, and it's really exciting to have you here in the first session of the Triton Leadership Conference. My name is Kimberly Phillips-Bohm. I'm president of the UC San Diego Alumni Board of Directors, and I'm very pleased to have one of our own, Al Zollar, who has a long career in industry and is a leader in industry and has deeply connected to the topic today. And we are also joined with Dr. Sean Travers, who is a campus diversity officer and director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Resource Center here at UC San Diego. Before we begin, I would like to go through just a few ground rules. And then I'm going to turn it over to Al Zollar and Sean. Al is going to speak first, and then Sean and Al will have a conversation. Can I have next slide, please? Okay. The UC San Diego Principles of Community. The goals of the principles include providing fair treatment for faculty, staff, and students, encouraging a climate of fairness, cooperation, and professionalism, fostering inclusiveness, respect, and a welcoming environment, promoting collaborative attitudes and actions. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we are joined today by Alfred Zollar, class of 76, who's an advisor for Cirrus Capital Partners and SolarWinds. He's also had a long career with IBM. Sean Travers, Dr. Sean Travers, is also an alum of UC San Diego. He's the campus diversity officer and director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Resource Center here at UC San Diego. Today's topic is the Allyship Challenge, the new white man. Al, welcome. Thank you so very much. And I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. And thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject. Perhaps we can move to the next slide. And the next one. Next one. So why now? Yeah, I wrote this essay and posted it on LinkedIn in July of 2020. It was in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. A little bit about my background, if you haven't noticed it. I've worked at IBM for 34 years, right out of UCSD. And following that, I had the opportunity to become an investor, a board member on public companies, and also the opportunity to do a number of philanthropic things. But the George Floyd incident caused a lot of the folks, particularly a lot of the white men who were in positions of power in boardrooms and C-suites, to ask me and my colleagues, what should we do in this moment? And, there are a lot of things that have happened. There are a lot of words, maybe more words than deeds in some cases. But I was motivated to write this because I wanted to present a challenge to really specifically the white men that I've had a chance to work with in these boardrooms and C-suites. I've worked with, way more white men than other people, women or people of color, or LGBTQ. And I find natural allyship with those other groups, but some white men have been more difficult, and that's really kind of the idea. We're at this point in time, post George Floyd, where we really do have an opportunity here in the United States, globally, and hopefully once and for all, to fully confront racism. And again, that's what this is about. Next slide, please. So the concept of race is, as many of you know, especially those of you who had any type of scholarly study around this, it's not a real thing. It's an invented concept. It was invented by self-proclaimed white men of European descent, and I believe really to rationalize their efforts to marginalize and exploit indigenous people, people of color, either of African descent, Native American descent, Asian descent. And that sort of position of dominance in institutions, whether they be businesses, governments, education, has lasted about 5 centuries. In fact, as we sit today, white men are still overrepresented in positions of power in boardrooms and C-suites. And despite the progress in maybe the past 50 years by white women and some underrepresented minorities, almost all leadership positions are disproportionately held by white men. Next slide, please. So a little sidebar, again, recalling the time frame that I wrote this just after the George Floyd incident, I took some time to try to understand what was happening with policing. And policing goes back to, slave patrols in the United States. And then, of course, the first municipal police departments in the 19th century. And this is yet another example of the overconcentration of power in the hands of white men. The brutality associated with many of these organizations is historically well documented. And in fact, we've had many, honest attempts at policing reform, whether they were led by what I'll call new white men or women or people of color, but they've mostly failed. And one of the reasons they failed is if you look at the union leadership of many of these municipal police departments, you will find a bastion of very conservative, old white men. And they have been people who have tolerated and even hidden illegal actions by their members and defended them to the tooth. And again, many of us from the Black community for sure know that these types of actions and abuse are not new, but in the words of that famous philosopher, Will Smith, they're now being filmed and recorded. Next slide, please. So you're probably at this point saying, okay, what is he really talking about, an old white man versus a new white man? Well, first off, let's set the record straight. This has nothing to do with chronological age. I have met many young, old white men and many old, new white men. And so next slide, please. A new white man, in my view, is someone who has understood that in this diverse world that we live in, they need to take steps to self-immerse themselves, especially in the lived experiences of those who are underrepresented. For example, Black people. They take proactive steps. They're not waiting to be spoon-fed by someone who's more informed or educated about these lived experiences. They take proactive steps to understand the lived experiences of others, and they're true advocates for inclusion. They are prepared for allyship beyond words. They commit deeds and resources to promote equity and inclusion. So that's again my definition of a new white man based on the folks I've had an opportunity to deal with. So what is an old white man? Next slide. An old white man are those white men who are very comfortable living in their bubble, whether it's residential enclaves, management teams in boardrooms that have no diversity, exclusive clubs that have no diversity. They might tolerate inclusion. They'll accept a token, person of color or woman. And they might be inclined to support gender inclusion a little bit more because they actually have proximity to white women. They have mothers. They might have daughters. They might have wives. They might have sisters. And post George Floyd, many of them were quite challenged by their woke kids who were going out and protesting and coming home and sitting at the dinner table because, again, they weren't at the university given COVID. Let's move to the next slide, please. So I want to make sure that I point something out here. This is not about waiting for a magical transformation of white men in order to make progress. Past progress in civil rights and equity have come, in my view, really despite the resistance put up by many old white men. In fact, one of the best allies I point out in the article was the most powerful white man, Lyndon Baines Johnson, through signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But I also believe that while we're not, again, waiting for this magical transformation, future progress can be slowed and has been slowed and very possibly will be slowed by the actions of these old white men. But I do believe in that, piece from Dr. King about the moral arc of the universe. Next slide, please. So all of this led me to really conceive of a challenge. I've been very fortunate to have worked with, some incredible leaders, people that, I feel honored to be in the presence of. And frankly, the majority of them are white men. Too few of them have been women or people of color. And I had to make a choice. That choice was if I wanted to be a part of their world, I had to understand their lived experiences, whether it be the sports they like, the venues they like to frequent, the culture that they like to participate in. These weren't, no one put a gun to my head and made me do these things. I didn't know anything about wine growing up in the ghetto of Kansas City, but it was nice to become a little educated about wine from some of my white male friends. But the fact is, there's a choice. And the whole point of my article was to write this essay and to present those individuals, those white men who I've interacted with a choice. Are you on the journey to becoming a new white man or willing to start it? And I call it a journey because I think, frankly, you can be in the beginning, the middle, or the end, and I'm good with that if you're truly somewhere on that journey. Or are you an old white man who is comfortable in his bubble, and as we've seen perhaps more recently, are willing to cling to power by any means necessary? So my challenge to all white men in positions of power, and again, really to all of us, is to accept my challenge and to become a new white man. So that's the essay, and Sean, my partner here, is going to join me in the discussion, and as will Kim, and we look forward to interacting and in a chance to hear what's on your minds.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Al. Sean, before we start with your conversation, I thought that I might take a minute just to circle back to our keynote this afternoon, a keynote address this afternoon by Tim Weiss, who was blunt, but Al picks up on the important parts of what Tim was saying. And that is that being an ally is about confronting power, and the power that has been used to maintain systems. And good, as Tim has said, well-meaning, well-intentioned people can be deeply engaged unknowingly and knowingly in maintaining those systems of power. And what Al was also saying, really making real and alive, was this very important point, that being an ally is a verb. You have to get into it and you have to stay with it and you have to be willing to help make change. So Tim, it was a great setup for this panel, but I turn it over to Sean and Al to have what I have will be, I'm sure, a lively conversation. We will follow it with time for questions, and we will let you know when you can begin putting questions in the chat. Al and Sean, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimberly. And Al, thank you for the overview of the article. I hope folks got a chance to read it. I've read it a number of times. One of my favorite phrases was magical transformation, and not waiting for that magical transformation, knowing that really old white men are at a point where they do have a choice. And what really struck me as you were sharing just now, as I read the article was your ability to influence them. And I wonder if you will tell us more about when you were in those boardrooms, what opportunities did you see? What were you able to influence some of the old white men? And did you see any new white men emerge?
Of course, yes to both of those. In terms of sort of the one of the things that actually helped inspire these thoughts in writing this essay was in a board meeting, one of the large public companies, Fortune 500 company, and we were talking about diversity and looking at the subject of diversity for that company. And we happened to have a pretty diverse board. There were 3 people of color, 3 women out of a board of 12. And the women and people of color were very engaged. One of the white men, who I definitely then categorized as an old white man, didn't say a word. But afterwards, we had a dinner following the board meeting. He began saying things that made it pretty clear that he really was, in fact, just tolerating this discussion. He was not prepared to do anything to lean into it. And then he went on to talk about his wonderful golf trips to all these exclusive places that not many other people get to go to. So again, that would be an old white man. There are many examples of guys that I would call new white men. One of them responded immediately to my LinkedIn post. He was my mentor at IBM, a guy named Nick D'Onofrio. And he said, "Al, I accept your challenge." I said, "Nick, you're the poster child." Nick went out of his way to mentor as many women and people of color in IBM as he could. And not only did he mentor them, he was a very strong sponsor, not just for me, but many others. And I could go on and on and on about the things that he's done to really have deep understanding. He shows up in places that old white men don't show up to. And so, again, many more examples. I'll give one that maybe is a little typical, or topical, I should say, given what's happening with the NFL. And he had some troubles that had nothing to do with how he felt about diversity. He had maybe some other issues, but the former president of ESPN was a guy named John Skipper. He's a white guy from Lexington, North Carolina, went to high school, segregated school. And, as he made his journey through the media industry and ultimately to become the president of ESPN, he realized that in order for ESPN to connect with, women and people of color, he needed to change the diversity of that organization. And if you've watched that organization over a period of time, one thing you've noticed is they have been at the forefront of putting women and people of color in all positions, not just in front of the camera. Again, so there's many, many more. And the nice thing about that example is it actually turns out to be quite economically advantageous, or certainly at the time, to ESPN in terms of expanded viewership. So again, many examples we could talk about.
And I appreciate that, because so much of your experience and what you write about in terms of the framing of old white men are people who have money and power, and they are in business, and they are in business to make money. But yet, as Kimberly was reflecting on Tim Wise's presentation, allyship, being an ally, is a verb. To whom do you ally yourself with? And those examples that you gave are, to me, clear directions for folks that may be thinking, oh my gosh, am I an old white man, or do I fall into that category? I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what to do. Al, what I just heard you say was mentor. What people of color are you mentoring? What women are you mentoring? What LGBTQI plus folks are you mentoring as an old white man conscientiously trying to change the power structures through mentoring people into positions of money and influence within business, in order to change those structures to be more inclusive. It is not saying I'm an ally. It's actually doing something like mentoring, like reaching out and trying to say, can I get this person to be my boss eventually, right? Can that be my goal, is to get this person to be in a position where they have power over me in doing the work that needs to happen. I often think about that in my own journey as I have worked with a number of folks is, how can I get them to the next step, and eventually I'll ask them for a raise.
Yeah, no, again, it is really about, at the end of the day, a very simple word, empathy, and curiosity. It's about wanting to know what these humans who share this planet with us really experience, and how is it different than your experiences, but what can you do to help, equalize opportunity so that we don't have another 500 years of overrepresentation by white men.
Yeah, it takes real action. We heard from Tim such clear calls to action. Kimberly, you echoed that. And I think about your piece as a call to action for old white men. And I see in the chat, where do we fall in? I would argue I absolutely fall into the category of old white man. And I say that because for me, the journey of trying to ally with people of color, trying to ally with others, is one where I'm constantly conscious that this is the vessel that I've been given to do that work. And it always shows up this color. This is what I got to give. And so that means I have work to do every day around understanding what does it mean to be white, what is white culture, how enmeshed am I in white culture, how do other people understand white culture, what can I do with the things that are related to whiteness to help them no longer have such deep impacts on people of color.
Well, Sean, we've known each other a short time here. I can say for sure you are not an old white man. You are clearly, and again, that was really one of the points of the article, is that this is a journey. And you are clearly someone who is on that journey toward a deeper understanding of the lived experiences of people who are not white men. And so, again, that by my self-proclaimed definition makes you a new white man. Again, I had one response to the article on LinkedIn from a European businessman who, was claiming that I was somehow reverse racist because of the fact that I was buying into this concept that race is not a real thing. And, my response to him was to ask him about his company and how many people of color were in it. And then he kind of shut up. But my response around this notion of white, black, and all the terms we use around race is that I really hope at some point humanity can evolve beyond them. We are people who, ancestors came from lands, mine from Africa, yours from Europe. And by the way, none of that's really pure. I've got German in me as well as a little bit of Irish, and maybe you've got some African in you, who knows? I think as people are discovering, taking DNA swabs and discovering their ancestry, there are a number of people who are being woken up to the fact, but we are people whose ancestry descends from lands, and we represent a hue of humanity. It's well beyond this black-white, but we're kind of stuck with the handles in this moment.
Absolutely. Race impacts me every day, right? Me showing up like this means it impacts me. Does it mean that my common humanity with you is not real and 99.99% the same? Absolutely. This idea that we all have a shared humanity, but race has had such impact in this country for 500 years. And this moment in the last 2 years although there have been moments, and I heard you say this clearly in the article, we saw in what most people call the civil rights movement of the 60s, we saw another moment.
We did.
Where we thought things will change. And they did. Arguably, you can see evidence of change. But now we are in another moment where can we change? And this is my question often to myself. Can I change other people that look like me that are desperately clinging on to power? And some days I can't, and some days I hit I don't hit people, sorry. Some people feel like brick walls that I'm just knocking my head against.
Yeah, what we're taking on here, again, has literally been built up over centuries and generations. And, I'm not naive enough to believe that it will just, again, magically transform and change. But the direction, again, that march towards a more inclusive society, one that recognizes, the true value of diversity. Research has shown over and over again that diverse teams, diverse organizations, diverse pursuits will produce higher outcomes and better outcomes. And so, again, that's the march I believe we're on, despite the resistance.
I think so too. I really do. And what struck me was your connection to children. And of course, college students aren't children, they're adults at this point. But we are here today because it is UC San Diego that we have this love and affiliation to, and the students that are here that are talking to their families, that are talking to their parents in the ways that you describe, that they are challenging their families around what you were taught, what their parents may have been taught, what their aunties and uncles, their tios and tias were taught about race, what they're learning about their own understanding of race as they're watching the protests related to George Floyd's murder, as they're watching the Capitol being stormed, as these things are happening, their ability to potentially, because most college students I know do not have a lot of money, right? But they have connections to people that are somehow supporting them. And how can they influence them to move us more quickly, to move us more quickly into the society that we want. And it's just, to the degree that we can support those young adults that are here at UC San Diego to have those conversations, to have the skills to have those conversations, I think makes a huge difference, because maybe some of their parents are sitting in those boardrooms and they're old white men, but they can be new white men.
Well, and it's also kind of interesting to me because, I'm a child of the 70s at UCSD in the early 70s, and was at Third College. We wanted to name it Lumumba Zapata College, but the folks ended up choosing a wonderful name after Justice Thurgood Marshall. But that sort of militancy that I had at the time as a young person, as I've had, it's maybe matured and mellowed a bit, but it's not left. And, I think one of the things that's happening in corporations and many organizations today is that as this part of the baby boomer generation is making its way into these positions of power with more diversity than there was before, I think we have been a catalyst for some of the changes that we're beginning to see.
Yes, I think you have too. I mean, when I hear your story and I hear about you were the only one, and you had, you have more empathy than me, I will say, because to sit in some of those spaces and hear what you heard, and yet know that you wanted to have the conversations to change people.
Yeah. Well, and it's actually more than that. I knew that I had the power to change the organization, whether or not this old white man disagreed. So he could sit there and, be, passive aggressive, whatever. But as a board member, I had the power to influence other board members and the CEO and the management team. And if I'm successful, then, and again, it's not about me. It's really boards operate as a collaboration. It's about really trying to get a body of people to think in a similar way. Then you can move the needle for it. And a great example of this is one of the boards I'm on is NASDAQ. Well, we have promulgated a rule that asks companies to either hire a woman, underrepresented minority, including LGBTQ, or if you don't, explain why you don't, as a way to be transparent to shareholders about that aspect of your culture. Again, California is a mandate. This is not a mandate. This is, comply or explain. And these are this couldn't have happened without the board supporting it. And I was really proud and pleased to be a part of supporting that initiative with the NASDAQ.
That's absolutely incredible, right? Like NASDAQ, like I watch this on the news every night, rise and fall, as does my retirement, right? And
more falling lately.
Well, you and I have now had a good piece of our conversation. Kimberly, I want to turn it back to you because I know we have some questions in the chat. I'm not sure how we want to engage in these next ways.
We do. And I've jotted some down. And I think what I'm going to do is just ask people and to keep putting in their questions. And if I miss you, please, ping me and say, hey, could you ask my question. Sheila Obrecht wants to know, how can we change the bias, especially at places where old white men remain most prevalent?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, I think that I'll take the example of the police unions that I did a little bit of looking into. I couldn't find anything other than a very ultra-conservative white man in charge of the police unions I looked at across, again, several major cities. And so the pressure to change that probably has to come from within the union. It probably has to come from women or people of color who rise to positions of power, get elected because it's an elected kind of a thing, and are in a position to change it with allyship from those who are outside of the organization. So I think that's what it takes in probably all of these examples where you see sort of bastions of old white men clinging to power.
And for me, I think if I'm embedded in a place and trying to change that place that's already got this old white man culture, it depends, how am I positioned? What are my identities? Who do I have a connection with that I can influence? And can they influence another person, right? And how can I use the conversation with someone that I know might be open to a conversation, and can then they have that conversation with the next person who might be open to it? Because I know sometimes for me, directly confronting power is an ineffective way of being an ally, but having an authentic and real conversation with someone who I believe will hear me, and they then are able to carry that water of influence and change to the next person who hears their voice differently than they hear mine. That's some of how I try to address bias and encourage others to address biases within a system, of course. If you're outside a system, sometimes you can knock against it. But in a system, if I want to keep my job, right, I have to figure out a strategy to influence change within a system. It's a great question, Sheila.
Yes, thank you, Sheila. Sam Knight wants to know, how do the new white men make the overt changes necessary and not fall prey to their own implicit biases, as Sheila asked? He's asking for a new white man who he knows personally.
Well, Sam, thank you for the question. Again, I think this is much more about attitude it's a mindset and a plan of action. It's a mindset that says, I don't know what it feels like to be a Black man who walks into a store and is followed around just because he's a Black man walking into the store. Or maybe you do know about that, but that's one example of the type of lived experiences that as we gain an appreciation, and again, this needs to happen this needs to happen in all directions.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be open to learning more about, the plight of my Asian friends who, despite looking to be overrepresented in a lot of settings, aren't achieving, perhaps the kind of executive positions that, they should be in organizations. And so it's all about really trying to take the steps, being proactive. I have met some, what I'll call old white men who had new white men tendencies. In other words, they were happy to have people feed them information and enlighten them about the lived experiences of their colleagues, but they weren't so willing to put any of their own effort into it. And again, that to me is the difference.
When I think about the experiences of those of Asian descent in our country, and how those narratives are so different yet similar to those of African descent in our country, and in particular the last 2 years, those of Asian descent, and how violence towards, in particular, the elders in that community, physical violence, murder, death, threats, and fear of our oldest who are of Asian descent. And then what that means, Al, as you're asking the question, to this idea that we want folks to access all kinds of places where they can create change. And both of those things are happening concurrently. How do I figure out, or people like me in terms of my implicit biases? I assume they're always there. Like when I first heard about implicit biases, I didn't take a class, learn what they were, and now, okay, I know what they are, they're gone now.
Mm-hmm.
I took a class, I learned what they are, and I went, oh, I have to think about this every day?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I do. Oh, do they show up when I least expect them to? And then I have to catch myself, and then people I know and trust call me out on my implicit bias? Oh, yeah, that happens too. Oh, that's uncomfortable. Oh, that's still happening to me. Oh, yeah, still uncomfortable. That to me, the normalization for me of being uncomfortable because I am deeply implicit biased, because that's the nature of it. That's why it's implicit. It's there.
I'm reminded of a speech that my sister, who was a well-known choreographer, and I'm proud to say this year won the MacArthur Award for her decades of work in the field of choreography. But she has a speech that she gives where she walks into the stage and says, "I am a bigot." And she lets the pregnant pause stay there for a moment. But she then says, "But I'm a recovering bigot. And let me describe to you my 12-step program." Again, riffing off the Alcoholics Anonymous sort of 12-step program. And in many ways, that's a journey that all of us are on.
Right. What you're both saying, Al and Sean, is the ways in which we first have to start with ourselves, because we're often, and understand, we're in these institutions, and how do these institutions work? And how do I get power from the way the institution works? I mean, I was in the university for how many years? The tenure system, for example, worked for me. I went to an Ivy League graduate school. That worked for me. I had to help begin to say, how come we only look at applications from people in the Ivy Leagues? Maybe we need to start looking at other universities too. They have great graduates too, especially the state schools, and tend to have more diverse student populations. So you have to start with yourself. And I think let's move on. We have so many questions and only 12 minutes left. Hadassah Tate wants to know, do you see any areas of influence that are championing equity more effectively than others?
Hadassah, thank you for that question. Look, I think when you see a diverse person at the top of an organization, that usually is a good sign that that organization might move, not always, but might move a little more strongly than some other organizations. Our fearless leader, Chancellor Khosla, is is a real champion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I can think of the people of Indian descent that I've had a chance to work with, whether it be Arvind Krishna, the CEO of IBM, or Sudhakar Ramakrishna, the CEO of SolarWinds. Probably not surprising that they're champions of diversity, as is Tasunda Duckett, the CEO of TIA. I think that's one way to see it. But again, we can't wait for that to happen. We'd be waiting, again, another 500 years. This has to come from a more organic transformation of all individuals, but especially those who are overrepresented in positions of power.
We have several questions that really get at the notion of power. Power as something that is imbalanced to begin with, that maybe we need to actually think about power and holding on to power in different ways. And I think how do we think about power, and how do we confront power? Because simply confronting power and then claiming the power for ourselves may not be the answer.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Power to me is best used when shared. If you assume any amount of power and you really try to hoard that and not share it, whatever organization or endeavor you're part of, I believe you'll be sub-optimizing it. I think there's many examples of that, and certainly it's been my lived experience.
What came to my head, Kimberly, around that, and in relation to the last question, different ways that we think about how things even operate. I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matters movement, one of whom was a UC San Diego alumni, Alicia Garza, and how those three women, from the foundation of the creation of that hashtag and that movement, saw it as a deeply intersectional movement, where there was a sharing of power that was equitable, where no one owned it, but there was leadership happening, where we saw real change, but we didn't see real change in terms of in a boardroom, but we saw real change on the ground in the lives of people, and the ways that mutual aid as a concept of really trying to make a difference in the lives of people that really need it was outside of government organizations, was outside of the 501c3 nonprofit organizations, and was this much more human way of making a difference in the lives of those that are deeply impacted by economic realities, racial realities, and realities where they are separated from the resources they need to get through. So that's kind of what I think about as a completely different model than the model that we are in right now.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know Alicia Garza was a Triton, so go Tritons.
Yes, she's a Triton. Patrick Cardin wants to know, how can those on the new white journey balance career ambitions with a mission to diversify workplace equity? For example, should we forego aspirations for higher level positions, or do our best to ensure active allyship if we do reach those positions?
Oh, I think active allyship will help you reach those positions. The power of teams is what all organizations operate on. And to the extent that you are known as a leader who is really good at building and growing and making effective diverse teams, that will power you, further than I think if all you ever done is work with people that look like you. So I think it not only is, it's not a choice. I think it can be an element of that success.
100%. The phrase I've heard it described as by a number of Black women in my life is, you lift as you climb.
Exactly.
Yes. And I remember years ago when I first started my career in the university, I heard the complaint, we can't find any scholars of color. And then I thought, okay, goodness me, you're filled with scholars of color now in your university as undergrads. Raise them. So part of allyship is making sure that people near you or who coming behind you rise, that they have you help clear the road so that you make a pathway for them, however that might be. Don't hoard power or hoard information. So, which is something that you were saying, Sean. Ping Ye wants to know, if one sees old white men behavior in the boardroom or C-suite, how do you have those crucial conversations to shift their behavior?
That's a very good question, Ping. Thank you for it. It can be delicate. The old white men that I believe I've served on some of these boards with, I have not confronted directly. Again, some might argue that I should. What I've tried to do is surround them with people who thought more like me, and with new white men, so that we could neutralize them. And maybe one day I'll find the skills and tools I need to be more direct without, and of course, I guess the keynote speaker said, be hard on problems, soft on people. I think when you're in a board setting, you have to work in a collegial manner. So it's challenging to have that kind of direct confrontation, but that's an area where maybe I can work on some skills.
I heard you give the answer in your essay, Al, which is their children may be best positioned to have those crucial conversations and be heard, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons I really loved the article was, every father wants to be a hero to their child. And if we can empower young people in particular to have the right conversations with their families, that can shift things more quickly. Some folks I've heard say, we need to wait for new generations to come into, and I'm like, I don't have 50 years to wait. It needs to change yesterday. But I think that listening to young people, hearing their realities around what this world should be, gets us closer to saving the planet ecologically, gets us closer to a more equitable way of how wealth flows in our country. I wouldn't be working in higher education if I didn't fundamentally believe that the young adults that I work with are really where our energy should be.
Amen.
Yes. Mike Zucker has asked a question. It has a long prefatory statement coming from a book by here I go. I'm trying to see the question. Let's see if I can do this. From Eckhart Tolle. And he's got a book called A New Earth. And it postulates that a connection to egoic identity dictates perception. So we see the world in a way that allows us to preserve this egoic identity. And so he actually, going down to the question, he wants to know, what are your thoughts regarding the notion that we can attack systemic discrimination by infusing attention to mental health as a key construct that actually, clinging to power may be a sign of, some mental health problems?
Well, that's an interesting perspective. It's not one I've thought about. I think there's potentially something there that we can stay, a corollary to this, which is there are people in power who have mental health problems that, are a huge problem. I won't point to any examples that are coming to mind right now, but I'm sure many of us can. So that's a very interesting observation.
Makes me think about how as I've reflected on being raised as a white boy and as a white man, really learned early on to dehumanize others, because that is what had been happening for the 500 years prior to my birth. That white men dehumanize anyone who's not a white man. And that to me is a mental health issue. That the idea that we can dehumanize women, that we can dehumanize people of color, that we can dehumanize, and by we, I mean that I can dehumanize that and still be thought as mentally well, is a systemic problem. And so as I think, it's a difficult question, but as I think about the ideas of my ego, right, these Freudian concepts, right, the ego, I think how it connects to a deeply embedded culture where I have been swimming in this idea that we can dehumanize, and our country has dehumanized people, real human beings, and made them other for so long. If we can get mentally well around that, if we can work on that, then we might shift some stuff. That's a very esoteric answer, but I hope that helped.
I'm coming back to a thought from Dr. King, who says that racism is like a gangrene in the soul of America. And he, of course, as he really became deeply connected to the anti-poverty movement, understood wealth that also dehumanizing people, the kind of accumulation of deep wealth like that. And so that to sort of see this as, and I think, some of the essays in Tim Weiss's anthology get at having to start with the self first, to really grapple with why are you in this institution, or what cultural work is this organization doing, or is this idea doing? What cultural work does it do for me? Why am I invested in it too? In what ways am I invested into it? It requires a deep, deep interrogation that few of us have done, myself included, on so many issues. And so this is, I think, really being uncomfortable with oneself and asking some of the questions that we're talking about today.
Yep. We have to be comfortably uncomfortable.
We have to be comfortably uncomfortable. We are down to any final questions from anyone. Did I miss anything? I'm scrolling through my chat here. I think.
Promise for quick answers given our time.
Okay. What I'd like to do is just give Sean and Al a few minutes more, just to final thoughts. And as people leave here and think about what next for me, what can I do next to help, start my journey or continue my journey, or be part of deep change that needs to take place. I mean, as Al said, we cannot wait for another 500 years. We have to take care of the planet first. We have to save the planet, and so that means fixing ourselves rapidly. So turn it back to you.
So Sean?
So if you look like me and you're on this call today, right? And you're thinking, what am I going to do tomorrow? Or what can I do? And you have not deeply explored white identity development. How did I become white, and what does it mean for me? I encourage you to read the works of two Black women who have wrote extensively about white racial identity development. And it has been pivotal for me as I've understood myself, in particular as a white cisgender man. They are Janet Helms and Beverly Tatum. Janet Helms wrote the first work, and this was in the early 90s. Beverly Tatum followed up the work. Her most famous work are Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? and it starts to explore white identity development. If you haven't taken that journey yet, I encourage you to read both of those authors to help you understand, who am I in relation to being white? That's a step.
And so in closing, first off, I want to once again thank you all for inviting me to participate in this conference. I hope that I've been able to offer some thoughts, some food for thought. Indeed, when I wrote this, it was intended to provoke some thought. And actually, I'll offer one last challenge to this audience. I love being in the presence of true scholars. And I think that there's an opportunity for additional scholarly research on beyond what I've sort of put together in a layperson's essay. And so if any of you are so inclined, I invite you to accept that challenge, and I'd be happy to collaborate with you in any way that I can. So again, thank you very much for having me. I wish you all a very successful conference, and I look forward to interacting with you somewhere down the line.
Thank you both. Thank you, Al. You can find Al's article on LinkedIn, and I'm sure you're probably going to get quite a few more connections, Al. Sean is a resource, an amazing leader on campus. And so I'm sure we will continue this conversation. I want to thank the audience, for the participants, for your deeply thoughtful comments and questions. You came with great empathy, you listened, I listened, I learned a lot. So thank you to everyone. And thank you to the team behind the scenes, Robin and Kevin, and Brianna, who worked tirelessly to make this panel happen. All right, thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.